Okay, it is 11:03. I think it's time we got started. Welcome everybody to this HMIS Data Standards Updates webinar, where we will be talking about how the latest data standards updates for fiscal year 2024 provided by HUD and the VA and HHS will affect your ClientTrack environment. We are looking forward to helping you understand what to expect. Just to give you an overview of our agenda, next slide, please, Jessica. We will introduce our presenter, our product analyst, Jessica Fleming, who will also give you a timeline for the data standards updates and how they will be rolled out into your ClientTrack environment and what to expect, the current status of how we got to where we are right now, and then an overview of the changes coming and also a deep dive. And then at the end, we will do a freeform Q&A. For those of you who are just arriving now, there is a Q&A function that is already available. Feel free, if you have any questions, to put them into the Q&A, although we will probably preemptively address some of them. Next slide, please. Now, many of you might be familiar with the HMIS memes on Twitter and on social media. This is our best attempt at reminding you of their most recent meme, where they had a dam holding back all the flood of data standards updates. We hope that Eccovia will function as your guide, if you will, and we look forward to fielding all your questions. So now with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter. Jessica Fleming is a product analyst for Eccovia. She leads the development of HMIS solutions within ClientTrack and assists in implementing more streamlined processes. She also helps improve case management and better care coordination at the community levels. She holds a BA degree from Duquesne University and enjoys working at Eccovia because of the widespread impact of streamlining HMIS processes for continuums of care across the country. Jessica has worked closely with HMIS for more than 7 years in various roles, including the functions of data quality, programmatic monitoring, federal reporting, coordinated entry planning, and as the organizational representative for a data analysis committee. So she has quite a lot of experience in HMIS, and we look forward to hearing from her. So without further ado, let me just let the new arrivers know that their questions can be addressed in the Q&A function, and we will pause for questions periodically throughout the presentation, but we will also have a free-form Q&A at the end. So thank you, and take it away, Jessica.
Thanks, Bryce. We're going to get started on our timeline. So just kind of making sure that everybody knows where we're at internally, and making sure, to know what to expect in the coming months. The vendors did receive the data standards on April 1st. And so from April 1st until now, we have been kind of synthesizing all of the different updates, attending weekly vendor calls with the other vendors, TA firms, and HUD, just to make sure that we all kind of understand exactly what's being asked, and also providing any kind of initial feedback on those specific data standard updates. So we have been working on that, and that has kind of led us into the data standard intro webinar today. Moving forward, starting in June is when development of the updates are actually going to begin. So in the meantime, we wanted to make sure that any suggestions, comments, concerns, anything of that nature is shared over with us so that we can take that into consideration before development begins. Something that I know is going to be a hot topic is the coordinated entry activity updates. So of course, anything related to coordinated entry is always a little bit cumbersome, and everybody does it a little bit differently. So we wanted to make sure that there was plenty of time to devote to talking through the coordinated entry updates. So you will see a second webinar in this series come out in June at some point, and that will be strictly around the coordinated entry activity updates. So you will be able to register for that. And then, that will probably be one of the middle to end things that we're actually working on doing the development of, just to make sure that everybody is, all of your suggestions have been heard. We've talked through any concerns, and overall kind of how your business processes actually work, so that we can make sure that what we're actually doing with the updates will meet all of your needs. So the development for the updates will last sort of through August. And then we are going to do some UAT at the end, so user acceptance training or testing. So that'll just be internal teams coming together, making sure that everything looks as expected. That will be, of course, being done kind of along the way, but the goal is kind of mid-August for all of the updates to be completed. And that is ahead of our September 1st kind of release. So our plan is to release all of the data standard updates to your environments on September 1st, or the first business day in September. And so that way everybody has time to get training materials and any updates that you need to make, testing, that kind of stuff completed throughout the month of September, so that we can make sure that everybody is hitting that October 1st deadline for when this needs to actually be released into production environments. This is my first time, of course, with ClientTrack working through the data standard updates. And if this is also your first time, generally speaking, for the time in September, there won't be any syncs that are happening from your training to production environments, because we want to make sure that the data standards aren't released into the production environments until October 1st. So that is just something to keep in mind for that specific timeline. So if you have any updates or anything that you need to be synced over to production, make sure that that happens before all of the data standards are released into production environments. Something else is that when we do release the training environments or the data standard updates into your training environments, that will be another one of the webinars in our series, just to make sure that everybody's kind of aware of what to do with that, and kind of where to find all that information, and if you have any questions or concerns. So that will be the third in our series, and then we will likely do a fourth closer to October 1st, just so that we can make sure that any any issues that we've identified, or things that maybe weren't able to be released on that September 1st deadline, that all of that stuff is actually getting released and everything makes sense, so that we're all kind of prepared and on the same page for that October 1st deadline. I also kind of wanted to point out, so when thinking through data standards, the biggest thing I think that everybody thinks through is the data elements themselves. So how are your forms going to be impacted? What about your specific data collection practices, that kind of information. But also all of those data elements are actually kind of what are feeding into all of our reports. So specifically right now, the information that we do have that HUD has released are the data dictionary and the HUD CSV specifications. So those two things are currently on the HUD Exchange. They were released a little bit late from what HUD had originally promised, but we did see all of those roll out to communities on May 5th. So if you haven't seen those are posted. And usually the easiest way to find them is just to Google the HUD Exchange with the HMIS data standards, and it should be one of the first things that pops up. I would highly encourage anybody to take a look at those if you haven't already, just so that you're kind of aware. They're the exact same documents that we'll be using and figuring out how to implement everything. But those are the two pieces that we have currently. And then we'll be slowly waiting for the release of the reporting glossary, which will have information for our data quality reports, COC APR and ESG CAPER specifications. So of course, all of our data elements that are getting updated are also going to impact our annual reporting. Same thing with the COC CE APR. Hopefully that will come out sooner than later, just because I know that that's a pretty hot topic. With any luck, that will actually come out before our CE activity webinar. We've also been told that the PATH annual report will be updated and released, and LSA specifications, and also the system performance measures. So all of these things are going to be coordinated with the data standard updates, and we haven't received most of the actual specifications or details from these from HUD yet, but we are kind of anxiously anticipating and working to make sure that, you know, the data dictionary, the data elements themselves are updated to make it as easy as possible to update those reports. I want to jump into the overview of the data dictionary updates, just to kind of give everybody some context of what's actually going to be updated, and then we'll do a deep dive in a few minutes. But mostly we've got 5 new elements, so there are going to be 5 brand new things that are kind of introduced. Some of them are actually mapping, which we'll talk about, but they are 5 new elements that you will see. There are going to be 5 elements that are retiring, and we'll point those ones out as well. Client prefers not to answer, so HUD is doing away with client refused and replacing that with client prefers not to answer. I think that's been announced in the HMIS lead and sysadmin calls previously, so that shouldn't be too shocking. However, I know that a lot of times, if you've created any training documentation or anything like that, replacing client refused with client prefers not to answer, it's not a hard update, but it is definitely pretty tedious. So that's something to keep in mind. And then finally, the living situation and housing subsidies. So HUD has broken out the specific prior living situation, current living situation, and exit destination. There are options in there for like rental by client with a particular type of subsidy. HUD has now made that a dependent question. So you will choose rental by client, and then the second question will pop up that says what type of subsidy are they using. So again, not a huge change because the subsidy types are mostly remaining the same, but that is something that's impacting more than one element. So I wanted to make sure to point that out. On the left-hand side, you'll see a chart. So the first one that's showing up here now is metadata. So you're going to see the categories of how HUD kind of breaks out the different data element categories. The blue bar on the bottom is the total number of elements that exist in that section. And the orange bar on the top is the number of elements that are impacted by these data standard updates. So this is just to kind of give you a frame of reference in how big the changes are actually going to be and which pieces of your process they might actually impact the most. So for metadata, there's 10 elements total. There's only going to be one update. That's a brand new field. We'll talk about that. It's not something that you will have to do anything with. It's something that vendors specifically will have to assign to specific implementations. Next up are the federal partner program-specific data elements. That is a mouthful. And so these are things like VA-specific questions, HOPWA-specific questions, COC-specific questions. So there are 42 elements total, and only 16 of those are getting updated. So some of those are retiring or going away, and some of them are, I think there's at least one new question for the federal partner program-specific data elements. We've got our common program-specific data elements. So these are the ones that are shared across the different types of federal partners, but still are program-specific. So there's 16 total elements, and there are 5 of those that are being updated. And then we have our UDEs, or universal data elements, 15 of those, and there are 6 that are being impacted. Those are things like race, ethnicity, gender, some demographic information mostly. And then finally, PDDEs or project descriptor data elements. So this is going to be your project setup stuff. So there's 7 total elements and 5 of those are going to be impacted. So this is probably the biggest category that we'll see an impact on. So just to keep that in mind as we're walking through all of the different specific updates as we get into our overview, project descriptors are definitely going to be the biggest impact. Alrighty. So jumping right into the project descriptor data elements, these are the specific elements that are going to be updated, and then what the actual updates are. And then I wanted to also make sure to highlight how that is going to impact ClientTrack in particular. So specifically, if you have a lot of customized forms, workflows, drop-down lists, things like that, this will probably be very relevant to you. Just to make sure that you can start to prepare like how to actually do some of those updates and which pieces to pay the most attention to. So first we have project information. So project information is getting a new project type. There's actually a typo on this page because they changed the specific project type. But emergency shelter night by night is now getting split out to night by night, and then also emergency shelter entry exit. So those two are going to have some mapping that come along with it. And instead of having the emergency shelter tracking method, I think is how it was done before, there's going to be a mapping that basically says if the project type was an emergency shelter and the tracking method was night by night, they will be this project type. And then if it was emergency shelter and entry exit, it will map over to the other project type. So there shouldn't be any manual data entry for that specific update or change, which will be very nice. And there are specific mapping instructions that are also posted on the HUD Exchange that you can see kind of how they're advising vendors to be able to do that during the change. While they are removing the separation of night by night and entry exit with a sub-question, they are introducing a new sub-question for rapid rehousing subtype. This will be a new dependent question for all rapid rehousing projects that basically say, are you providing actual housing assistance, or are you providing, I think it's housing assistance and move-in assistance as well. So one of them services only and one of them isn't. So that will require some manual data entry. There isn't a way for us to be able to determine who and which projects in particular offer which type of service. So that will be something that after the go live in your production environments, I believe HUD will come out with some specific guidance of how to do that. But that will be something that communities will have to go back and actually look through and make sure that that's all correct. And then finally, there's a couple of verbiage changes. So in the actual setup, so I think instead of victims of domestic violence, I think the update is survivors of domestic violence. So there will be some small tweaks to drop-down lists and things like that. And that kind of all impacts the workflows. So project types usually drive at least part of the workflow. So it'll impact some workflows, definitely forms, project setup forms. And then as I mentioned, you'll have to do the manual data entry after go live for that rapid rehousing subtype in particular. Next up is funding sources. So there are 2 retired funding sources, and there are between 2 and 3 new funding sources that they're introducing. So anytime there's a new funding source, there will also have to be some workflow updates for that as well, just to make sure that all of the required questions are showing and displaying whenever you're working through that workflow for that specific funding source. Bed and unit inventory. These are very small changes, but because of the rapid rehousing subtype update, if there isn't specific, move-in services or housing services that are offered, then you don't have to fill out inventory. And that's one of the main reasons I believe that HUD said they made the project information change. And so there will be specific rules about which projects need an inventory and which ones don't. And then also because the emergency shelter tracking method is going away, we will definitely have some different rules on forms for that as well. Next up, so these next two, participation status and CE participation status, both of these are the brand new questions. So participation status is specifically going to try to gather information about how or which projects are actually participating in your HMIS implementation and which ones aren't. So I believe there's 3 different options. There's going to be that the project is not participating. The second is that the project is participating. And the third is that the project is participating in a comparable database. So specifically, if you've got DV programs in particular that are not permitted to enter into HMIS, but they are entering into a comparable database, that's when that one would be captured. Luckily, because we already have the HMIS participation question from previous standards, we can do a lot of mapping for that one. And there are specific mapping instructions for how to map that. But that will only be for projects that are not entering into a comparable database. So any DV specific programs, you will have to go back after go live and modify that they are participating in a comparable database. So unless they come out with a different type of mapping, that is the plan, I think, as of now. And then finally, that CE participation status, that's the second new element. This question will get at whether or not the program is actually providing coordinated entry services, and if so, what kind? And then if they aren't providing it, are they participating in coordinated entry by receiving referrals? So this, I believe, we haven't seen, of course, the specifications just yet for the new CE APR, but hopefully this will make everything a little bit more streamlined. And also this CE participation status question will also be used later on whenever we talk about the CE activity element that they're implementing. So there will be some how this question in particular is answered, how that will actually feed into the drop-down values and everything else that you're able to see when doing the CE activity. I am going to pause on this slide before moving on to the next to see if there's any questions.
Yes, we had one from Alexis. Toward the beginning, she said, do you recommend canceling any of our routine monthly syncs?
I definitely would reach out to your CSM and confirm specifically for September what that might entail and whether or not you need to cancel preemptively for September.
Thank you. Oh, and for all of those arriving or who have arrived late, we have the Q&A function. We will periodically pause for questions like we are now, so I wanted to draw your attention to that. But we will also have a free-form Q&A toward the end of the webinar, so thank you.
Moving on to the universal data elements. So these are a few more updates. So there is a merging of race and ethnicity. So that means that the ethnicity element itself is retiring, and race and ethnicity are now going to be all in one multi-select dropdown. And there is also an additional new race option that's going to be available. That specific race option, I believe, is Middle Eastern or North African. So that's going to get added into that as well. For the merging of race and ethnicity, this is going to impact all of our implementations, so not just HMIS. And so we need to make sure that we're being very careful about this one, just, in case anything. But there is going to be specific mapping instructions that happen for how we should be moving over the previously selected ethnicity values into race. So one of the questions that came up on the last vendor call specifically was, what happens if I selected client doesn't know or client refused for race, but I did select that the client was Hispanic or Latina. So at that point, what do we do? How do we kind of merge those two things? So I think that there is specific guidance in mapping that if ethnicity was specifically listed as the client identifies as Hispanic or Latino, then at that point, that would become the new race value instead of the client doesn't know or client refused. So if you have specific questions about that, then I would definitely check out the mapping document that's posted on the HUD Exchange. And that's kind of how we're going to be following how to merge those things. Luckily, the race field currently is already a multi-select. So those same rules will apply. You can select all of the actual values. You can select as many of those as you want or need. However, you can't select like the actual specific race values plus client doesn't know. So there's specific rules in there already about that. So the same rules will apply. Next up is gender. So they are renaming the gender options. So female is moving over to woman, male is moving over to man. And there's also going to be 2 additional values as well. So I think currently there is gender other than singular gender, and then there's kind of parentheses that outline whether or not it's a specific cultural gender, if it's a different identity, etc. So they are breaking that out a little bit. So that value will then be mapped over to non-binary is what will become that specific option. And then they're going to be culturally specific gender, and then also different identity. And then if you select different identity, there will be a text box that you are able to enter that information into. I think that's probably a way to be able to capture any other genders for future updates that we might need to make sure is being added just for inclusivity purposes. So that, of course, will entail some form updates and making updates to those specific drop-down lists or multi-select lists. For destination, as I mentioned before on the overview, there is going to be a separation for the housing subsidies. So now if you select the client exited to a destination of rental by client with a housing subsidy, that dependent question will pop up that says, what type of subsidy does the client have? And you'll be able to fill that out. And then there's also going to be some new headers. So HUD did break out the temporary and permanent situations. So now instead of just homeless, institutional, and then temporary or permanent, there will be homeless, institutional, temporary, permanent. Those will all be separate. So it'll be much clearer kind of how HUD is calculating certain things. So you will see those updates on forms with that dependent question, and you'll also see some mapping of your existing exit destinations to go over to the housing subsidy types. So all of that information will still be retained and it'll just be mapped over. The next change is for enrollment COC. So this used to be named client location. This I have had and seen several issue tickets that were related to this in particular, but enrollment COC is now moving for data collection to only at project start. So only when you're enrolling a client do you need to collect the enrollment COC. We did specifically ask a question about this one to what happens if the client has a different COC for an update as it stands. And the mapping guidance that we've been provided is that we should use whatever the project start client location was whenever considering mapping this over for the data standard updates. So there might be some nuance that is lost in translation for the mapping of this. In particular, But hopefully moving forward, it'll be a lot more clear on how to actually capture this and make sure that it's as accurate as possible, especially for reporting. So hopefully by just having a one-to-one relationship with client location and the enrollment, it'll streamline a couple of things. This will also mean, of course, that there are going to be form updates. And then, as I mentioned, there will also be some mapping for this as well. And then finally, for universal data elements, prior living situation. So in a similar vein to destination, there is that housing subsidy dependent question that's going to get added. And so there is in the mapping document that HUD has posted, there is specific mapping instructions on how to map your current, I don't want to say current with a living situation, but your currently selected prior living situation, if that contains the fields that are going over to the dependent subsidy question. So that will get updated on the UDAs and any forms that you have prior living situation on at this time. So there will definitely be form updates for that. And then, like I mentioned, there's also going to be mapping for the existing values. And I just want to pause for questions again. Any questions on this slide?
We had a question from Tiara Parker, but I responded to ask for clarification because I didn't understand the second part. But the first part of her question was, should gender and sexual orientation be merged as well?
Gotcha. So that's not how HUD has it currently. I'm sure HUD usually is pretty good about asking for feedback on data standards. So that might be something that they've considered, but as it stands now, that isn't something that they're planning on doing. Sexual orientation, I believe, is still going to be a separate question altogether. There is an update to sexual orientation for these data standard updates, but it is in which funding sources are required to collect it, not necessarily where it belongs in the workflow, or is it getting merged into gender?
Thank you.
All right, move on to the next one. So common PSDE updates. So these are the common program-specific data elements. So these are ones that are likely going to be pretty widespread across all the different funding sources. However, maybe not all project types are going to collect them. So the first update that we have is health insurance. So the VA health insurance is getting updated to Veterans Health Administration. It's just a verbiage update. So the only thing that's going to get updated for that is the list itself, and any compliance crosswalks that you have. You'll just see that that language has been updated. And next up was the current living situation. So in the exact same vein as the prior living situation and exit destination, you will have your dependent question that will ask about the type of subsidy. If you select that the client is currently living in a rental by client with some sort of housing subsidy. And then also there are the separation of the temporary and permanent situations in the headers. So HUD has clarified kind of how to display that to users. So that will be there as well. And that will entail form updates and also mapping of the existing values that you have selected for current living situation. So none of that data will be lost. It will all just be mapped over. And then we have 4.19 and 4.20, which are the coordinated entry assessment and coordinated entry event options. So these two elements are retiring, and there are certain pieces of those elements that are getting mapped over into the new element, which is 4.21, coordinated entry activity. Coordinated entry activity did change with the release of the data standard updates to communities. So this is one that we still need a little bit of time to make sure we're synthesizing and understanding properly, especially before our next webinar. So we'll definitely do a deep dive into what exactly that looks like, and how we can make sure to implement that to be as straightforward as possible for everybody. We are assuming that there are going to be form updates and workflow updates for those elements in particular. And then also there is some mapping from some of the pieces of coordinated entry assessment and coordinated entry event that will be mapped over into the new element. So not everything is mapping, but some of it is. So there will definitely be mapping of existing values for that. And I will pause for questions from the Q&A as well.
This is just a reminder, if you have any questions, please put your question into the Q&A function of the meeting. I see someone has their hand raised, it looks like. So is that Daniel? Daniel, can you type your question into the Q&A, please? We'll move on for now, but we'll try to address your question once you type it in.
Sounds good. Next up are the federal partner PSDE, or the federal partner program specific data elements. These are just going to show you kind of which specific federal partner program these are relating to. So we'll start with the COC ones. So C1, well-being, that's a retiring element. There is no mapping. It should just be retired. At this point, HUD has said that they're not interested in collecting that anymore, so that will be retiring. And then there's going to be a new question, which is C4, translation assistance needed. This is a question that specifically will ask, does the client need translation services? And if yes, then users will be prompted to select the specific language that individual needs translation services for. So for that one, there's going to be form updates because it's going to be a brand new form. And then there will also be workflow updates to make sure that it's incorporated and asked to the correct project types and funding sources. Next up are HOPWA. So services provided, there's a verbiage change for that. So that will likely be updating on the form directly or on the drop-down list. Medical assistance, there's going to be a new field and response option. So that will also be a form update. And then housing assessment at exit. There's going to be a verbiage change on the response options. So again, that will be a form or drop-down list update in particular. So if you have specifically HOPWA funded projects, looking at the forms these elements are collected on is going to be a good bet that something's going to need to get updated. Federal partner for RHI, runaway homeless youth. So we have sexual orientation, which was mentioned before. This is opening up to permanent supportive housing projects as well. So that's going to be a workflow update. So the specific question itself isn't changing at all. It's just who is required to answer that. So if you are a permanent supportive housing project, keep an eye out for that. Then we also have RISE service connections. So there's a verbiage change in the response option that will also get updated on the form or the drop-down list. Project completion status is the same. So verbiage change in the response option. That will also be a form update and or drop-down list. R18 counseling, just a verbiage change in how the question is asked in particular. I think it's one word that is changing, but we'll make sure that that gets updated on the form itself. And then another retired element is worst housing situation. This is for the rural housing specific funding source. That funding source is actually being retired altogether. And so there is no more federal partner program for that specific funding source, which is, I think, why they're retiring this element. So that'll be a form update by just retiring it altogether and also making sure that it's not asked in the workflow anymore. And then we get into the VA Federal Partner Program. So veterans information, there's a new response option, which is Space Force, whenever asking I believe it's the part of the military that they served in. And that'll be a form update or a drop-down list update just to make sure that that's available to select. Services provided, there's a verbiage change in the response option itself. So form update or drop-down list update. Financial assistance for SSVF. There are two new options, which are landlord incentive and tenant incentive. I know that these are not brand new options, that these are options that likely were added a few months ago. So you might already have your own way of collecting those. So that will get updated. That will be something that we'll need to pay very close attention to for anybody who's got SSVF funding. And that will be updated on the form itself and or drop-down lists. Percent of AMI for SSVF eligibility. They're slightly changing the AMI percentage categories. So I believe it was previously 0 to 30%, 31 to 50, and then 50 plus. They're changing it to 50 to, I think it's 80, and then 80 plus. So there are mapping instructions for this one on being able to map what the specific client's AMI is and making sure that they're assigned new categories. So this is something that if you do have a custom form for this, something also to pay very close attention to make sure that those categories are getting updated appropriately. Then we have last permanent address. So that field in particular is being retired. So that will likely be a form and or workflow update depending on if it already exists on another form. And then finally, the HP targeting criteria. So there's a change to verbiage in one of the dependent questions. And so that will just be a form update to be able to make sure that that verbiage change is made. And we'll move on to the very last one and then pause for questions. So we have metadata and other elements. So these are pretty small metadata and other elements. The very first one is implementation identifier. So this is one that I mentioned you all don't have to do anything with. This is a specific implementation ID that's going to get assigned to your implementation and your environment. You basically already have one. It's the thing basically that you see whenever you log in that says you're in this environment. I think HUD is going to be using these to be able to help deduplicate across multi-COC implementations and implementations that have recently gone through vendor switches and things like that, just to make sure that everything is very consistent and that they can easily identify kind of where each client is coming from. As I mentioned in the overview, we have the drop-down lists. So client refused is changing to client prefers not to answer. So that is not a giant change, but definitely something that's going to be pretty tedious to have to update all of the training information and any, intake forms or anything that you have like that. It will be a tedious update for sure. So that means that all of the drop-down lists that currently use client refused will be updated to client prefers not to answer. And then we've mentioned this a couple of times, but Appendix A is all of your living situation options that are used for exit destination, prior living situation, and current living situation. So all of those have been renumbered and also some of them are being recategorized into temporary versus permanent housing situations. Hopefully that will make everything a lot more streamlined, but it will certainly be an update to forms, to some workflows, and also drop-down lists. So just something to keep in mind as we're looking at what is getting updated. And I want to pause for questions now, if there are any more.
Yes, we have a couple. Errol asks, going back to the new emergency shelter project type 15, will Eccovia map all the projects that have the night-by-night method to 15 or only current active projects?
The guidance that HUD has released for mapping instructions say to map all of them. So it is not just the current ones. It should be all of them.
Gotcha. And then Nathan asks, is Eccovia preparing to update these fields for their COC clients, or will COCs be tasked with updating these fields? How much work will this create for COC HMIS admins?
Yep. That's a great question. So Eccovia will be updating all of our baseline forms. So if the COC uses custom forms for anything, that will be on the COC admins to be able to update for their specific implementation. However, if you do use baseline forms, all of that information will be updated for you. And at the very least, if you do have a ton of custom forms, hopefully this webinar, the CE activity webinar, and making sure we have kind of an open line of communication will help make that a lot easier, so that we can answer any questions that you might have, and make sure that this is as easy as possible. These data standard updates are definitely a big lift for everybody who has to deal with HMIS in general. And so specifically, I know that the admins, I was previously an HMIS admin, and so I know specifically that admins have a ton of work to do before that October 1st deadline. So we just want to make it as easy as possible.
Thank you. I want to remind everyone to use the Q&A function if you have any questions, rather than raising your hand in the top bar of the meeting. So please go ahead, and if you have a question, just go ahead and do that, and we'll get your question in there. Miles asks, will we be able to access the recording of this webinar? If so, where? Miles, I can answer that for you. We will be making this available online, so no need to worry about that. We will definitely distribute this so that you get a recording. Let me see. I'm just we'll give you guys just a couple more seconds to write any additional questions. Go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. Just go ahead and type them there, and I'll review them and ask them on your behalf. We'll just take a pause here to let people. Oh, okay. So apparently the Q&A function is not enabled for some people. Is that correct? If that's the case, if you're not able to access the Q&A function, go ahead and signal with the thumbs up emoji. Looks like we've got a few people like that. Is that okay? Okay, that is wow. Okay, we're getting a few people reacting. Okay, that was not anticipated. I apologize for any inconvenience. That was a new that's a new problem I've not run into before. So thank you for letting me know. Okay, we will take these. Well, okay, so go ahead and all right, let's do this then. Go ahead and raise your hand if you do have a question and you're unable to use the Q&A function for some reason. Okay, let me see here. Daniel Ramos III, I believe you're the most enthusiastic hand raiser of this meeting, so we'll go ahead and let you go first since you've been having this issue for a little while now. Let me see here. Let me find you. Keep your hand raised if you still have a question. Keep your hand raised so I can turn on your mic. Okay. All right, Daniel, you're on. You're on.
Hi. Yes, I was just trying to communicate with emojis and hand raising. So
Yeah, no problem.
apologies. I didn't know how to send the signal out. Thank you both. My question is, when I think about kind of what our needs are on our end is the sequencing of this. So you may have put dates out, but when do you plan on having the baseline forms updated so that we can buffer in time for training using the system in real time to our end users and do our webinars that we need to do?
Great question. So here is I just want to flip back to the timeline slide here. All of the data standard updates for baseline forms should be released to training environments on or around September 1st. So it would probably be whatever the first business day of September is. That everybody will have access to that in your training environments. And we'll also do a webinar around then to make sure that everybody kind of is on the same page and if they have any questions or anything, we can get those answered.
And then second question, this is the last one for me. Will we get an updated list of the new tables and the mappings that we would use? We have a lot of custom queries and Data Explorer and Query Designer and launch forms that we'll need to update with whatever changes are made to, let's say, race and ethnicity, if that's a new table or how that's going to work. Will we get something like that, or can we get something like that?
Yep. So I think in previous years, there's been an impact document that's been shared out. So we'll run a kind of a query to look at all of the different implementations. And if you have specific forms that are customized, things like that, we'll be able to compile those and let you know that these things might be impacted, hopefully to make sure that everything is a lot easier and that you all can do the updates that you need to do for any custom forms or queries.
Great, thank you. We had a few people raising their hands earlier who weren't able to use the Q&A function, but your hands aren't raised anymore. So would you please raise your hand again so I know who you are, and we'll see if we can get your questions answered. We've got just a couple minutes left.
While we are waiting on that, I did just kind of want to point out there's a couple of items that are specifically flagged as the biggest impact to you all. So I just want to make sure that that is handled here. So of course, CE participation status is going to be a brand new question for everybody. There is going to be manual data entry that you have to do afterwards. So that's going to be a big impact. CE activity, we are devoting an entire webinar to that to be able to talk through any questions that you all have and make sure that we're implementing that one as you need. Race and ethnicity, this one might not seem like a huge impact, but you are going to have to update a lot of information. And I know that there's some concern. We've heard it raised on some sysadmin calls, and some vendors have raised it as well. If somebody identified as white and Hispanic, but only because they had to have an answer for race, what happens at that point? So that's something I think that communities are going to have to determine on a local level. I'm not sure that HUD's going to come out with something to do with that. And because we're mapping information, that might be a big impact. And then project type updates. So if you have anything that's specifically custom workflows, anything like that that has to do with project types, like specifically emergency shelter, that's going to be a pretty big impact. You'll have to make some updates to that. And additionally, those rapid rehousing subtypes, putting those in, you'll have to do some back data entry for that one as well. And then Appendix A, living situation. So these are kind of all of the items that are flagged as the biggest impact for everybody that we want to make sure make the most sense. And if you have any specific questions about those things, that we can get those all answered for you. And then finally, the best way that you all can start to prepare for DSU now. We don't have the development for the forms or workflows, drop-down lists. We don't have any of that done just yet. But we do want to make sure that if you're already aware of customized forms, workflows, drop-down lists, that kind of stuff, it's never too early to start putting a list of those things together of what's going to need to get updated. Looking through the data standards themselves, reviewing the data standards manual, that kind of information, just to make sure that you're all as prepared as possible. And then also flagging any internal training documents and videos for the elements that are going to get updated, because those are, of course, going to need to be updated as well, making sure that client refused is moved to client prefers not to answer, that kind of information. So, like I mentioned, there will be an impact analysis that comes out specifically, as there have been in previous years, to help identify some of this, but that likely won't happen until a little bit later in the process, after we know which forms are actually going to be impacted. And so if you want to get a head start, this is probably the easiest way to start doing that.
Oh, Daniel, you had another question?
Yeah, this is maybe can be an offline question if you can't answer it. We have admin services through Eccovia. Is that a service that helping us update workflows and any customizations we have to update to the new changes? Is that something that admin services are able to do as part of their scope of work?
I think that's something that's probably best answered from your specific admin and or your CSM, just to make sure that everything is covered and time is allotted appropriately and things like that. So yeah, it might be best answered by talking specifically to the CSM and admin.
Thank you.
Not a problem. Okay, so we had a lot of people asking to raise their hand, or that were raising their hand earlier, but I don't see anyone else raising their hand. So here, just to close out, if you have any additional questions or suggestions or comments after this webinar, you are always welcome to reach out to your client success manager. And we also wanted to remind everyone that we have begun a new community of practice. This is run through Microsoft Teams, and you can join those to talk to other people in your field, and learn from each other with best practices, and find new ways of using ClientTrack or Client Insight. And so we encourage everyone on this call to reach out to your client success manager and ask for access to that channel so that you can also keep up to date. There's also a specific channel for the data standards updates. So we would ask you all to keep your ear to the ground for that, and also to ask your CSM for further information. So, failing any further questions, thank you all for attending. This was very informative. We hope that you were at least edified somewhat by this webinar. We hope that you will continue to attend the others. Just as a reminder, we will put out a recording within the next few days, and we also are going to have further webinars to go through the specifics of the coordinated entry activity and how these updates will be implemented into your ClientTrack environment in the coming months. So thank you very much. Let's give a big round of applause via emoji to Jessica for her time and attention today. And thank you all for coming.